due to the widespread protests in Venezuela against Maduro's dictatorial regime and the ruling Socialist Party. It's important to understand the reasons behind the people's dissatisfaction and what factors have led Venezuela to this point. Venezuela is a country in South America with a population of approximately 30 million people. It is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of natural resources. With around 300 billion barrels of oil, it holds the largest oil reserves globally. In addition to oil, it has natural gas reserves and gold mines. At one time, Venezuela was considered the wealthiest country in South America. Unfortunately, this is no longer the case. For years, Venezuela has ranked at the top of the misery index worldwide. The misery index is the sum of the unemployment rate and inflation rate in a country. For instance, in 2018, Venezuela's inflation rate was 13,000%. This was the highest figure in the 21st century, and no other country has even come close to it. In order to avoid further embarrassment and to adjust the number of zeros in the currency, the government reduced the value of the bolivar 3 times. Once in 2008, 3 zeros were removed. In 2018, 5 zeros were removed. And again in 2021, 6 zeros were removed. Over the span of 13 years, 14 zeros were removed from the bolivar. This means that 100 trillion bolivars became just 1 bolivar. The value of Venezuela's currency is now so low that even supermarkets refuse to accept it for payments. As a result, people now use US dollars for their daily purchases. To understand how Venezuela arrived at this crisis, we must examine its modern history. Oil was first discovered in Venezuela in 1914. And the country quickly became wealthy. By the 1950s, Venezuela had the 4th highest GDP in the world. However, even at that time, much of the country's wealth was controlled by the wealthy class and those close to the government. In fact, there was little democracy in the country. This situation led to the rise of socialist and economic equality ideologies among the people. And over time, power shifted to the Social Democrats. Socialists seek to nationalize everything, from companies to institutions. This led to the nationalization of Venezuela's oil industry in 1976. The Socialist Democrats targeted various companies and made the country's economy more dependent on the government. Alongside promises like subsidies and free welfare services for the people, the country was led into a major economic crisis. While free services and subsidies excited the population in the long term, these policies caused Venezuela's economy to collapse. Carlos Perez, the Socialist Democrat president, made the market dependent on the government by promising these subsidies. He devalued the currency, inflation soared, and prices rose. After some time, Perez was unable to continue paying for some of these subsidies. For example, he eliminated the diesel subsidy, which further drove up prices. The country was on the brink of bankruptcy until a man named Hugo Chavez, with populist promises and messages that appealed to the people, became popular and staged a coup to seize power. When Hugo Chavez came to power, around half of the population was living below the poverty line, and the annual inflation rate was over 30%. Venezuela's two-party system had lost its popularity due to inefficiency and corruption. Chavez claimed he was not part of any of these parties, but he was lying. He was, in fact, a socialist. This became evident from his admiration for Marx and the actions he took later on. Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999 and officially became the president of Venezuela in 2002. He nationalized many private companies and fully aligned the country's economy with political policies. One of the fortunate factors for Chavez was that during his tenure, oil prices surged, which helped improve Venezuela's oil-dependent economy. Chavez, in the short term, was able to take advantage of the higher oil prices, but in the long run, the same problems persisted. The increase in prices, inflation, Chavez's aggressive foreign policies, and his confrontations with the West and the United States continued. After Chavez's death, his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, became the president of Venezuela. The people were not fond of Chavez, and now his vice president had taken over. Maduro inherited a country in ruins, primarily due to the dependency on oil, multiple sanctions, and Chavez's extravagant spending. Venezuela was completely bankrupt. Maduro, who was also a socialist like Chavez, continued the same policies. Unfortunately, this time, because the oil sales were not as profitable, the country's budget deficit was not covered, and soon subsidized food and medicine became scarce. Maduro implemented a multi-tiered currency exchange rate. This policy continues to this day, and some people who have access to the official exchange rates, such as the military and those close to the government, buy the cheap official currency and instead of importing goods, sell the currency at higher rates to the public. This has gained the military's loyalty to Maduro as it benefits them. Meanwhile, the people, suffering from poverty and inflation, have staged widespread protests against Maduro over the years. However, Maduro not only ignored these protests, but also rigged the elections whenever his term ended, ensuring he remained in power. The people have resisted Maduro and opposed him for years, continuing their activism. The reasons for their protests are clear: the horrific economic conditions, shortages of basic goods and services, widespread corruption within the government, lack of freedom of speech, the repression of the people, election fraud, and Maduro's dictatorial rule. For years, Maduro's government, with the help of Eastern allies, managed to suppress many of these protests. The first major protest during Maduro's presidency occurred 1 year after Chavez's death in 2014. It was sparked by the killing of a female protester and the assault of a student protester at a university. During these protests, 43 people were killed and 4,000 were arrested. The following year, in 2015, protests erupted in various places due to the detention of protesters and food shortages. Then in 2016, more than 1 million people took to the streets in a referendum to change the constitution, but they were once again met with failure. A year later, in 2017, the government dissolved the National Assembly, which included opposition parties, and formed the Constituent Assembly. This move triggered another wave of protests which escalated as opposition leaders were arrested. In the end, 165 people were killed and about 5,000 were arrested. The Constituent Assembly was formed, with all its members belonging to the ruling Socialist Party. In 2018, due to the pressure of economic problems and the prohibition of opposition leaders from participating in the elections, the people once again took to the streets. However, it was once again in vain, and the protests were suppressed. In 2019, protests flared up again, but with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the demonstrations faded and the protest ended with no results. During these protests, more than 100 people were killed and around 1,000 were arrested. In 2024, Maduro ran for president for a third time. His opponent, Edmond Gonzalez, supported by the opposition and the people, faced off against him. Despite knowing that Maduro would declare himself the winner once again, the people went to the polls and voted for González. As expected, Maduro declared himself the winner, even though many independent organizations that conducted surveys among the people determined that González had won by a significant margin. The people have once again taken to the streets, but this time with even greater determination. In various cities, they tore down statues of Hugo Chavez and burned posters of Maduro as a sign of protest. In the capital, Caracas, they even set fire to the mayor's office. Street protests are still ongoing in Venezuela, and there are even reports of police and military forces showing support for the people. The police, who also live under this regime, empathize with the people. In short, everyone is finding their own way to show their protest. Even those who stay at home bang on their pots and pans at certain hours of the day, creating noise from their windows to signal their solidarity, reminding each other that they are not alone. This act helps them stay motivated in their struggles. The people of Venezuela have been fighting for freedom for years. They have come close to revolution many times, but each time, with the support of the military and the Eastern Bloc, Maduro's regime has managed to suppress their efforts. For a long time, Venezuela was a case study for analysts, showing that despite the people's activism and political engagement, they still couldn't achieve significant change. Will they succeed this time?